Elaine Lee, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex.
U.S. warships and planes launched the opening salvo of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
After years of devastating cuts, we're now rebuilding our military like we never have before.
Hello and welcome back to Thank You for Your Service, a hard look at American civil military affairs from the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. I'm Nick Pereso.
And I'm Thomas Krasnation.
This is another special episode. We weren't planning on releasing any more until our Season 2 launch next Monday on Veterans Day, but we couldn't pass up the opportunity to talk to today's guest, Commander Guy Snodgrass, callsign Bus, author of the new book, Holding the Line, Inside Trump's Pentagon with Secretary Mattis. Commander Snodgrass served as Secretary Mattis' chief speechwriter during most of his tenure as Secretary of Defense. Thomas, can you talk us through why we decided to pursue this interview?
Yeah, so a lot of our conversations on Thank You for Your Service so far have touched on Secretary Mattis and his complicated role in the politics of the Trump administration. So this is definitely a book that both of us were interested in reading. But at the same time, a lot of people, including us, were a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of a recently retired military officer, Commander Snodgrass, someone who had occupied a sensitive position within the Defense Department, going out and marketing a book based on behind-the-scenes conversations that weren't originally intended for public consumption. That's not typically what you expect from military officers who are trusted with these kinds of jobs.
So we wanted to get a sense of why he thought it was appropriate to write this book. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, because we know that Commander Snodgrass has a really good reputation in the Navy, and we know that he must have thought about the professional and the ethical dimensions of this project before pursuing it. So we got in touch with him, and he was kind enough to agree to talk to us about his reasoning, as well as some of the civ mil implications of what he observed during his time working with Secretary Mattis.
Commander Snodgrass, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Good to be with you.
So we know that you've recently released this new book, Holding the Line, in which you describe your experiences as the chief speechwriter for Secretary Mattis. We were wondering first, though, if you could tell us a little bit about your career in the Navy and how that led you to the job of chief speechwriter.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things I've loved the most about my Navy career was there's so many paths you can take and so many kind of adventures you can inadvertently wind up in. So in my case, spent 20 years as a Navy fighter pilot, primarily flying the FA-18, both the Legacy and Super Hornet. I was a 1998 Naval Academy graduate, went straight into a program called IJEP, so Immediate Graduate Education Program up at MIT. And when I finished there, started my pilot training, which culminated with my first tour of duty in Virginia Beach, flying the Legacy Hornet, went and did a war cruise in Iraq, came back, got selected as a Top Gun instructor, so did Top Gun for about 2.5 years. And at the conclusion of Top Gun, went to Japan for the first time, and 3.5 years out there patrolling the Indo-Pacific, came back, went to the Naval War College, wound up, having a great experience, did really well. That put me on the radar for then Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Jonathan Greenert, who brought me in as his sole speechwriter. So that's where I basically cut my teeth, learned the ropes, had a little bit over a year with him in the role, and got selected for command. So I had command of a strike fighter squadron, the VFA 195, the Dam Busters, out in Japan for my second tour. And at the conclusion of that tour, wound up back in the States and in Mattis' office ultimately.
And so what motivated you to write this book? And why now as opposed to, say, 10 or 20 years down the line?
Well, I mean, it's actually twofold. One is just, frankly, availability. I was on my path upward whenever I had moved back from Japan. My wife and 3 kids and I, we've been moving all over the place, and we finally had some much-needed stability in Norfolk, Virginia. And we knew that we were on the pathway to CAG, so Carrier Air Wing Command. And it was right in the vicinity of Virginia Beach. So we knew that basically the path we were on, we were going to get selected for Air Wing and wind up having an opportunity for the kids to be in the same spot probably 4 or 5 years, which is absolutely unheard of at that point of our career. So got the phone call 3 months into that tour, asked to join Secretary Mattis up in Washington, D.C. I mean, it's Mattis, for goodness sakes. And, of course, he was someone I've always looked up to and have, frankly, revered, just like, others, like Admiral Jim Stavridis is another great example of someone who I deeply admire. So when I was asked, I agreed to be interviewed, got selected for the job. And that, as you can read in the book, it basically took me off my career path. So, frankly, it was just the fact that it was now available. I knew that if I didn't write it now, I probably never would. And I would tell you, too, the more I've reflected on the process, it's not lost on me that we're just inside of a year out from the 2020 election. And I watched being behind the scenes as whether it's the right side of the aisle, the left side of the aisle, there's a lot of misinformation, And we know that there's been Russian influence in the previous election. There's just people are using social media and even traditional media to really polarize the environment. And so to have the opportunity to take a firsthand account and share that with Americans so that they could read and better understand what's at stake and make an educated decision was what I wanted to do.
You really wanted to set the record straight for Americans about what was going on with the Trump administration.
It wasn't really singling out President Trump. I mean, obviously, we served in the Trump administration. I was a active duty officer the entire time that I was there. But it was more along the lines of, it's everything from the longstanding alliances and partnerships. It's the leadership lessons, if you will, of how you coordinate with your team, in this case, an interagency team from the White House. The successes you can have when you have a steady hand on the tiller, like Secretary Mattis, where we restored the budget for the military, where we produced the 2018 National Defense Strategy, where we brought ISIS to the brink of destruction, or at least the physical caliphate. So there's a lot of great things you can accomplish. But the danger, of course, is that if you have these well-coordinated strategies and plans, they're just a hallucination if you constantly undermine them by, I think the most easy example, right, is a tweet comes out and it undoes 3 or 4 months worth of work. And so while it's not really aimed at President Trump on any stretch, if you read it, it's very apolitical. I wanted to adhere to that approach. But it's an opportunity to say, these are some lessons. These are some great things that were accomplished. Here are areas where I think there's maybe points of concern. And to put down a 2-year kind of historical look at what it was like for Secretary Mattis to run the Pentagon.
So there's a lot of people out there who have seen the book and its publication and are just uncomfortable with the idea of a civil servant or a military officer who's in this position of trust, who has access to privileged and sensitive conversations, sort of deciding on their own that it's time for America to find out this information. And so for other civil servants or military officers who might find themselves in that kind of position where they might want to share what they see or what they have seen, what is the ethical and the professional framework for thinking through that?
Well, I'm going to use the answer I always use at Top Gun, and Top Gun instructors are famous for saying it depends. And I know that's an incredibly dissatisfying answer because, you kind of want that operational risk matrix where you can walk into it and say, well, if I come down the x-axis, go across the y-axis, my answer is yes, I can, or no, I shouldn't. And before I kind of dive back into your question, I would say I think it is interesting. There's probably a longer conversation to have about at what level of rank is it appropriate. Some hay was made about Secretary Mattis when he wrote his book, Call Sign Chaos, and he brought the readers behind the scenes for some of the conversations he'd had with Presidents Bush and Obama, and then also Vice President Biden, but current presidential candidate Biden, where he basically laid the deaths of tens of thousands of Iraqis at Vice President Biden's feet. I'm sitting there, as I read that, going, wow, that's a bold move. So I get your point. I think that it's one of those things that you have to take a look at your current environment. You have to determine, what do all the factors tell you? In my case, if Secretary Mattis was still in the office, wouldn't have touched the book because I understand that would have put him in an incredibly untenable position with the president. Also, I would think that you have to take a look at kind of the current situation and environment. It's not lost on anybody. We're in a highly polarized environment. It's a very politicized environment. And more so than probably in any recent presidency, the military's apolitical tradition is being threatened. It's being used to take more polarizing political positions. It's being used for sending troops to the border to help rally the base. I mean, there's a lot of reasons that I believe that it was important to, again, share a very apolitical, very even-handed approach. It's not pro-Trump, anti-Trump. It's not really pro-Mattis, anti-Mattis. It's just, here's what I had the opportunity to witness and observe. And I would put a capstone on all of that and just simply say that I did follow my legal and ethical obligations. I submitted it to the Pentagon. It was reviewed by the Pentagon, State Department, and the White House, who gave it approval. So I followed the policies to a T to make sure I could answer your question.
But who is the appropriate person for deciding that these stories, these narratives, these conversations should be shared? Obviously, Mattis opted to not include a lot of his time as Secretary of Defense. In his book, he opted to not share those conversations, and yet you did. So how come you were the one to make that call and not the principal decision makers?
Well, because I'm not sharing necessarily Mattis' story. I'm sharing my story. I'm sharing what I directly observed. I'm sharing the parts that I had a direct hand in, which frankly was quite a lot. So I think, that's the amazing thing about the fact that we have the privilege to grow up as Americans in America. Mattis can take that stance. And as I'm sure you have read, I know both of you are wide, diverse readers. You have a great awareness of the politics of our country right now. There's been probably about half the country who's spoken out against Secretary Mattis because he took that stance. They know some things have occurred behind the scenes. They believe that it is his duty and obligation to share that with the American public so that they can have the openness and transparency that we're typically used to having in this country. But he has elected to withhold his opinion and withhold his experience, notwithstanding a couple jokes at the Al Smith dinner recently. But at the same time, it's one of those things where I can respect his opinion. I think he's making the call he feels is best as a retired 4-star general, recently departed service secretary, cabinet secretary, that he's going to have be perceived differently than I'll likely be perceived as a retired Navy commander.
So Secretary Mattis and his office released a pretty harsh statement about your book, characterizing you as a junior-level staffer with no decision-making authority, trying to kind of cast doubt on your credibility. Mm-hmm. And so for listeners who aren't familiar with your role, with what a speechwriter does, we were wondering if you could talk a little bit about your responsibilities and how that gave you the perspective that you had to write about Secretary Mattis's role in the context of the whole administration.
Yeah, you bet. And it was funny because obviously a lot of individuals, to include service members, when they saw Secretary Mattis' statement said, how does this make you feel? What's your response? And I didn't say a word. I just simply posted on social media the Defense Superior Service Medal that Secretary Mattis gave me when I retired, which spells out all the roles and responsibilities and senior level. So to your point, the speechwriting job is unique to the principal. So you could have a principal that you work for who you work 3 floors away on the other side of the Pentagon. You maybe see them once every 2 weeks, and you get a little bit of a snippet of where they are and what they need, and you go back and write. And frankly, that's kind of been the traditional role of speechwriters in the Department of Defense. The comms director tends to have a little bit more access, but the speechwriters are typically in their own office. Mattis, when he came in, wanted to pull us into the right outside the E-ring where he was. We're on the same floor. And then, of course, my office was in Secretary Mattis' own office suite. So you're doing most of the things your principal's doing to be able to learn his voice. I mean, you study everything that he's written and produced, and a lot of the interviews he'd given when he was in between his role after he left as Central Command Commander, but before he came back in. You read and you look at his remarks when he was getting confirmed in front of Congress. So that's like the base you start from. And then now you're being pulled in. So everything from most every memo he released to the department, his memo on ethics, the ethical guidance, the being good stewards of taxpayers' money were all things that I wrote and drafted. And then he'll tweak it as we get further in. Same thing with the 2018 National Defense Strategy. There was a fantastic team, got a chance to work alongside. They handled the classified strategy. I wrote the unclassified strategy. And as you can read in the book, over the Christmas holidays, because it was a sprint to the finish. And then did a vast majority of his international travel during his year and a half in office. So everything from NATO ministerials, going over to Brussels, Belgium for that, traveling Indo-Pacific, Middle East, and everywhere in between. And I don't want to be remiss. A lot of times when you have a conversation like this, or certainly I've produced a book, it's easy to say, Guy Snodgrass, chief speechwriter. I had 2 phenomenal speechwriters that served alongside me, Bill Rivers, who had worked in the Senate as a speechwriter, Nicole Magny, who had come straight from grad school. Both of them were phenomenal. And as you might imagine, while I'm sitting in a lot of meetings, they're fact-finding, they're writing drafts, they're doing a lot of things to put together some great speeches. So it wasn't just a one-man band.
And as Thomas just alluded to, the secretary had issued some criticism, some critical statements against you, and other people critical of the book say that, it's self-serving, you're selling out. The secretary said that you had surrendered your honor. You worked with him, you know how he thinks.